Welcome to our first webinar on the Rethinking Generalization with the R.E.A.L Model course. So first, I'd like to introduce you to Brenda Terzic-Garland. Brenda is the CEO and co-founder of Applied Behavior Consultants, or ABC. This is a human services agency dedicated to enhancing the quality of life for people with developmental disabilities and learning disorders, co-founded in 1987. So Brenda has over 25 years of ABA clinical experience in the behavioral treatment of autism for children of all ages through adulthood. And she has over 18 years of experience in ABA intervention for ADHD and other behavioral disorders, specializing in child intervention, parent training, and acceptance and commitment therapy. And Brenda is also the creator of the R.E.A.L Model, and she's the author of the new book, the R.E.A.L Model, Rethinking Generalization. And next, I'd like to introduce you to Madi Ueda-Tao. Madi is the Chief Clinical Officer of Applied Behavior Consultants, and she's been with ABC for over 16 years now, where she works closely with Brenda. Madi oversees all clinical services across the agency and is responsible for all in-home and center-based programs, specializing in the treatment of autism. She also serves as the liaison for international services. And together with their staff at ABC, Brenda and Madi implement this R.E.A.L model in practice every day. And both Brenda and Madi teach the new course, this new CE course through ABA Technologies, titled Rethinking Generalization with the R.E.A.L Model. Before we start and jump in with the interviews, I wanted to show you the QR codes, and I'll make sure to show this again at the end of the webinar, and the links to these are in the chat. But the QR code on the left, that is for the course, and the QR code to the right is for the book, in case you're interested in checking those out. If you click on the one for the course or scan the one for the course and you're reading about it, you may notice that if you do end up registering for the course, you do receive a discount on the book as well. So again, you can access those links in the chat if you want to do it that way. And this is actually why we're here today. We have some frequently asked questions and questions submitted from students about the R.E.A.L model and the course content. So Brenda and Madi, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today to answer these questions and share more information. We're very excited to have you and eager to hear from you, and I know others are too. So we can go ahead and jump right into those questions. Does that sound good to you too? You ready?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, perfect. All right, so in the book and the course about the R.E.A.L model, you have the phrase rethinking generalization, and that's what the book and course is all about, generalization. So can you tell us a little bit more about how generalization became a topic of interest to you?
Well, I've had the absolute privilege of being able to see the field of applied behavior analysis evolve around the treatment, around the ABA treatment for children with autism. So when I first got started as a young behavior analyst, actually providing ABA treatment to children with autism, it wasn't really well known. And I had school districts say, well, you're just the latest Campbell soup label, and at one point in time, it's going to go away. And it really was at the urging and behest of parents who really drove our field to be recognized as an empirically based treatment for children with autism. But it wasn't, first of all, ABA in general wasn't well known with respect to behavior analysis as a specific discipline, as well as what people's, I would say, medical professionals, teachers, paraprofessionals really knew about autism. And keep in mind that autism really wasn't diagnosed till like around the ages of 5, 6, 7 for the first, I would say, 10 years that ABA was even around. And it really wasn't until the work of Ivar Lovaas and his team who provided intensive behavioral treatment, came out with a 1987 study that it got recognized as a treatment to really, I would say, accelerate the skills cognitively, adaptively with children with autism if you provided treatment young enough and long enough. Now, as a practitioner back then, I had the opportunity to work with his team on a number of cases. And interesting enough, given my background, I actually am trained as an experimental behavior analysis, and not really, and most of my clinical training was in working directly with behavior problems. I even say to today that all my training and working directly with behavior problems across a number of disabilities actually aided in my, I would say, critical analysis ability to look at environmental contingencies in terms of how they affect behavior. Well, through the course of time over, I would say, a 2 to 5 year period, one of the things that all practitioners, whether you were at a clinic supervisor level, whether you were a director, was in the area of generalization. And I found myself, as I was working on these cases, the supervisors or clinic supervisors would be focusing on curriculum and saying, well, we just need to change the curriculum, or we need to have the child start all over. And I would say to myself, well, no, what's really missing is a conceptualization of how to go about analyzing generalization in the natural environment. That repeating curriculum over and over just wasn't getting these kids to generalize more readily. Surely there has to be something more. And that really is what kind of piqued my interest in, well, what can I do as a practitioner to train generalization in a way that not only are the people that are implementing these lessons, but how it would benefit the child in regards to what and how the child interacts in the environment. Because in general, remember that children or anybody, an organism operates off the environment, and the environment affects the organism. So when we look at child behavior, we have to look at those contingencies in relationship to what we are teaching the child to actually do. But more important is, how do we get the children to not engage in rote responding, or literally see the skills that we've taught them over a specific period of time, literally in some cases not even occur once you put them in the natural environment. So that's really what piqued my interest. And it was really just kind of sad for me to say, wow, we spent all this time working with this child and the generalization is just not maintaining. So keep in mind as well that typical children also have difficulties with generalizing behavior, but the difference is that you can teach them through trial and error. You can have reminders. When you look at parents in terms of children just following rules in general, the children will read the faces, the body gestures of the parent or the teacher who's telling them, remember this rule, or raise your hand when you have questions. That is generalization because they're not doing it on their own. The only difference is that they didn't have to be systematically taught. And what I really learned through this process is, well, if we can teach children basic imitation, basic instruction following, basic play skills through repetition, then why can't we teach generalization or teach for generalization in the same way? And when you look at the breadth of our effectiveness with ABA treatment, generalization deserves the same level of intensity and focus in training and intervention as any basic skill that we would teach a child.
Excellent. Thank you, Brenda. I'm glad we started with that question. Sorry, give me one moment. So this is, the R.E.A.L model is all about generalization. So can you tell us a little bit more about the R.E.A.L model?
Now, I would say, capitalizing off of what I just mentioned earlier, what really was missing was a behavioral framework for teaching generalization. And initially, when I first developed the R.E.A.L model, I just referred to it as the 5 levels of generalization that I put in a particular chart, both theoretically and application wise. In other words, just because you know the theory with respect to the different types of generalization that need to be trained doesn't really mean that you have a systematic framework in which you can go about programming for generalization. And at least in my experience, and even all the way up to today, when I look at practitioners generalizing, yeah, they can answer definitions, they can change stimuli to train for stimulus control. Yes, we know that response generalization is important. Maintenance was an interesting thing. It's not necessarily teaching the lessons less often. It really has a lot to do with when we look at maintenance of procedures and the measurement of behavior with respect to the child maintaining and persisting with the behaviors that we teach. That really, in my opinion, got hugely overlooked. And as I began to put this together and say, okay, yes, we know about stimulus control, we know about stimulus generalization, we know about training across settings and time, but wow, there's just isn't anything out there when it comes to, well, how do you go from a highly structured teaching session to just having the child go into the natural environment, and then all of a sudden the child's not able to produce the master of skills that they were able to do during these training sessions. And there was just a huge gap there. And then when I looked at it even more carefully, and I said, well, if they can't functionally generalize, then how are they going to have any chance of socially interacting in a way that's competent? And what I mean by competent is, I don't mean perfect. That I found myself as a practitioner, along with others that I trained, is that we narrowed our range of analysis to just what we were teaching during training settings. And when we look at ABA intervention as a whole, we're treating all aspects of the child's life. So generalization has to cover all aspects of the child's life. We have to have a conceptualization of what the child is doing day to day, what the parents are wanting for that child, and evaluate those contingencies in those natural environments from a conceptualization basis in order to develop a big picture and then a roadmap to how and what direction these ABA intervention programs are heading. I mean, I remember someone saying to me many times, well, when are we ever going to be done with this child? I just feel like we're never done. And for me, that statement was really loud. It really stayed within my repertoire. And I believe, with the way that I approach generalization from a systematic perspective, and then working your way into the natural environment and into the verbal community, is that we're not really trying to get these kids to, what I would say, be indistinguishable from their peers, which is what the word was, or the parents wanting the child to recover. We just want the child to be able to be in the world and benefit from that world in the same way that typical kids do, at whatever level that they are capable of doing it. So once you have a conceptualization of how the child is going to use these skills in all aspects of their life, then you can teach for generalization in a way that's systematic and move towards getting that child to be able to participate in day-to-day life without training. So what I did with the R.E.A.L model is I conceptualized the different levels of generalization that were necessary to be able to integrate in any existing ABA program. And if you think about it, 30 to 40 hours a week of programming for a lot of children with a behavior analyst carrying a caseload of 7 to 15 cases, and sometimes in some companies 20 to 25, that is a lot on a behavior analyst. And it's an enormous responsibility to have to provide that level of treatment and provide it at an optimal level of effectiveness. So when it came to the actual generalization aspects, I said, wow, it's missing. We have to look at generalization as a behavioral process of teaching. We have the science of behavior analysis, the principles of learning to be able to be highly effective. But how effective are we as practitioners if the child is not generalizing? And at least from my background and what I still see today, which I thought would maybe perhaps change over time, is oftentimes practitioners are given a huge caseload. They are asked to go out there and teach this curriculum, and that's it. There's not enough support. And I'm thinking, there just is not a book dedicated to practitioners that help guide them in this responsibility that we take on to literally change the quality of this child's life in relationship to family, community, to the way that they interact with peers. It's just completely missing. So the R.E.A.L model is a unique 5-level process in which skills are trained to teach for generalization, not linear. So you don't go from level 1 to level 2 to level 3. It's across the levels of generalization. So in the same way that kids with autism, there's no such thing as a child not having any skills. So we have to figure out some way to assess the children in terms of what they currently know. So there's a lot of good behavioral instruments out there for assessing children with autism with respect to basic skills, language, communication, self-care. But there's not anything out there in how we would go about evaluating how children are able to readily generalize. I wanted to move away from train and hope they're generalized to effectively teaching for generalization in a way that it encompassed all aspects of the child's behavior. And from that perspective, what the R.E.A.L model does is, because it's a behavioral process of learning, it's also a behavioral process of not only for the child, but it's a behavioral process of learning for the practitioner, for people who are involved with it, with actually generalizing the skills for the child, especially the parents. And I do believe that it's not done on purpose, but parents oftentimes are left behind, or they are fearful of getting involved with the child's program because they don't have the behavioral background that the behavior analyst has. So what the R.E.A.L model does, it's 2-pronged. It teaches for generalization of behaviors with respect to child behavior, and it also helps identify what is necessary to teach for generalization of training procedures, for which we are highly responsible for ensuring that the replication of these procedures is done in a way that's effective for the child over a 2 to 3 year period. And if you think about it, that is a really long time. I don't know one other discipline on earth that provides that much intervention with that much expectation in regards to changing child behavior. So I wanted to create this model in a way that we could systemize the teaching of generalization so that critical variables that influence day-to-day interactions with respect to generalization, because if you think about it, generalization is the missing piece of ABA intervention. It's not all about structured teaching, but I do believe that once, and when you look at the world itself, it's pretty huge out there. And as I had mentioned earlier, even typical kids struggle with generalization at some point in time in their life. And quite frankly, when you're learning something brand new that's complicated, generalization can oftentimes be difficult. So I wanted to enhance the quality of ABA services in a way that where you weren't like learning a brand new curriculum or a brand new method, but how could we teach for generalization working within any existing ABA program, independent of your training?
Is there anything you want to add about what inspired you to create this R.E.A.L model?
I'm glad you asked that question again, because when I first came up with the 5 levels of generalization, I actually referred to it as bridging let me think about that now. Bridging responses in generalized environments systematically. And then that particular acronym got stolen after I did a workshop that I had done with a school district. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to rebrand this my levels of generalization, because Bridges isn't going to work anymore. So, and then I was talking with my business partner, and he's actually the one that came up with it. And he calls me one day while I'm on the phone, and he says, I've got it. Recreate environments to accelerate learning. And I'm like, oh, that's brilliant. Because when you look at how is it that ABA is effective, more effective than any other discipline or any other theory or program out there. And early on, at least in the first 15 years of me being a practitioner, the resentment that participants would have, especially with people who've been trained as teachers to work with these. And I get it. It's like, what is it that we're doing? What are you doing that's so different than what we're doing? And it was a really tough time for teachers, for medical professionals, because they all of a sudden, we went from not knowing anything about behavior analysis, or thinking that behavior analysis is only limited to working with kids with disabilities or developmental disabilities. And now all of a sudden your parents are wanting you as the treatment of choice to work with children with autism. What is it that you are doing that is so different? And what I really, really want to emphasize is that the practice of behavior analysis is not, or when we look at the practice of behavior analysis and we're training other people, it's too easy for those that we train to say that the effectiveness in ABA treatment is inherent in doing discrete trials, and limiting behavior analysis or equating behavior analysis, the entire breadth of behavior analysis, to discrete trials training. I'm not saying that discrete trials training is not effective, but it's not the only method. It is a teaching methodology. It is the science and the behavior principles of learning that allow us to, again, look at those environmental contingencies that we are programming for that make the program successful, not a methodology and not a curriculum. And one of the things that, at least in my lifetime as a behavior analysis, is I truly, truly believe that we are at risk for our field getting watered down, which I believe it's already happening. And it's our responsibility to maintain the integrity, not only of ABA treatment, but of ABA treatment as a whole. And for all of us who are practitioners, one of our greatest challenges is staying true to the science of behavior analysis, not being afraid to use the terms, but keeping in mind who our audience actually is. And it's our job to be our goal on an ongoing basis is to be the behavioral artist. We have to be mindful and connect in the present time with the people that we're training in order to, because people want to work with these kids and they want to be successful. They want to work with the behavior analyst practitioner or any other professional who's working with their child in a way that is not conducive to the child, but as well as how they can be a participant. And I wanted to create something that could include not only the aspects of the child's environment with respect to generalization, but how do we get the people that are actually in the child's day-to-day life to be involved with the child in a way that is successful and positive for them. And that's really where I come from when I look at what continues to inspire me today with respect to the R.E.A.L model.
Thank you, Brenda. And so, as you know, ABA Tech is now offering the course on the R.E.A.L model taught by you and Madi. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the course is about?
I came up with the course, or the idea of creating a continuing ed course for rethinking generalization. So rethinking generalization with the R.E.A.L model is a twist on the actual title of the book, which is the R.E.A.L model, Rethinking Generalization. And what I've seen over time when I look at resources that are provided for behavior analysts or for any person providing ABA services is that, and I don't mean this in a sarcastic way, but I have said this to people I've supervised, the skills and creativity and competence of the behavior analyst is not in the number of resources that they have on hand. It's not the fact that they have, when a supervisor hands a consultant that they are supervising a bunch of research articles and says, here you go, this will help. Well, I look at that behavior analyst and I go, or that consultant, I said, well, do you have two hands? Can you get on the computer and get on the internet and look up those journal articles? Surely. So I'm not making fun of that per se. What I'm saying is that just because you have a resource doesn't mean that you know how to use it. And what I mean by that, when you look at the complexities of behavior analysis, when we just look at stimulus control, when we look at teaching for discrimination, there has to be a guide in the way that we go about using those resources in a way that we can replicate what our field has been able to show through research in terms of behavior change effectiveness. And when I got finished writing the book, and it is really true that when you're an author and you go to write a book, it starts taking a life of its own. And I didn't think I was, as a matter of fact, I had to cut out 3 chapters to condense the book somewhat. And I'm thinking, wow, when I go to read the book, I kind of stress out because what it really reminded me of, because I was coming from a practitioner perspective. This is really to honor all the practitioners out there because of what we have to do. It's exciting. We love what we do, or we wouldn't be out there. It's a lot of work, but seeing the child progress and seeing the families get their life back is just something that is so reinforcing in itself that I wanted to figure out a way that, how do I take this book that I just wrote that really represents what behavior analysts do day to day, and have practitioners use it in a way that is useful to them. We're inundated with continuing ed. I mean, every time you go on your email, you're getting some advertising about take this continuing ed, take this continuing education, and what am I going to get out of it? And one of the things that I know for sure is that when you are writing a book, you cannot capsulize in a short period of time. It took me like a whole page just to write out one example of how to teach for stimulus control or how to teach for concept formation. That's probably like, 4 pages. And each level of generalization is a chapter in itself. So I needed to create something that would give practitioners a way to use the book that was useful, but also be able to take what is written and say, well, what does that actually look like in action? I'm reading this example that she gave on teaching concept formation, and wow, okay, I didn't really look at it quite that way, teaching, training stimulus generalization, or training for stimulus generalization, but really training and shaping up and establishing concept formation. What does that actually look like? So what the course does is it breaks down the book in a way that I believe is user-friendly for the practitioner. You can actually say, okay, well, she talked about, creating a matrix to look at the the goals or generalization goals of the child with respect to the natural environment. She talked about level 1, which took like 25 pages. When you look at training across trainers, that's something we kind of take for granted. It's like, yeah, well, that's pretty easy. You know, this child has to have at least, 2 to 3 trainers to train on this particular program for today. And then we need to trade out trainers. But it didn't really provide, in my view, a way to break down what I would like practitioners to know without a course that could help inform the actual practitioner on how to teach for generalization. And so the other reason why I called it Rethinking Generalization was that, well, generalization has been spoken about, or we've known about generalization from the beginning of time. Conceptually, everything that you would need to know about generalization has been written. But what does that actually look like? How can I get practitioners to say, well, or go beyond, well, we've been taught this, it's taught academically in coursework, you can find it in journal articles. That's all been done. And I didn't want to repeat myself. But what has not been done is giving a course on generalization in a way that we can rethink about how we go about teaching for generalization, if that's the term you use. We know generalization is important. We know that, I know that the course needs to represent the breakdown of the different types of generalization that need to be programmed for in day-to-day life for the child, but also how do we go about including, so being inclusive with parent and family and not exclusive. It's not like we go provide ABA treatment and then the parents are just recipients of that. So the course allowed me to break down each aspect of the book in a way that I hope the takeaway is that practitioners say, wow, I hadn't really thought about that, or I'm going to just focus on concept formation. I hadn't really planned and prepared for that. I can do that across all my cases and keep everything else constant. Wow, I didn't really think about persistence. I only thought about maintenance across settings and time. I'm going to change that across the cases that applies to. And what the course allowed me to do was to be able to talk about all the levels of generalization and break them down in a way that practitioners could train across the levels of generalization, or take each level individually and capitalize on their learning of that specific level if they felt that they hadn't had enough, I would say, resources for that aspect of generalization. So I really enjoyed putting that course together. I was able to show not only what teaching for generalization looks like, actually working with a child through the pandemic, because some of the videos, the kids are wearing masks. I was also able to build in activities that are important to get the practitioner to rethink, to reanalyze, to study what I really want when I'm programming for generalization, and how do I go about measuring its effectiveness over time.
I think some of the activities you've included in the course has just made it that much better. The students seem to really like that, and it helps them better grasp the material. So can you tell us, so you've published the book, right, on the R.E.A.L model, and now
Yes.
you have this course on the same topic. Yeah, some of the students want to know how can both of these resources be used, or how do you envision people using the book along with the course?
The way that I envision it is it's always helpful to have specific clients in mind with respect to how you could go about using the information from the course, and then having the book as a guide as a reminder to what you learned from the course. I always felt that behavior analysis, especially in the treatment of autism, was easier to talk about than actually do. And we're talking even as basic as actually working with a child, doing the trials to teach for stimulus control. And even as an early learner in A.B. treatment for autism, I would sit back and say, well, I could do that. And there'd be professionals in the audience that said, well, I can do that too. And fluency is very critical. So not only fluency in the actual science of behavior analysis with respect to the conceptualization of our field, but it's a lot to remember. And you find yourself without prompts or cues doing the same thing over and over. If you don't help the RBT or the technician say, okay, this child now is at mastery level with these specific 4 concepts: imitation, instruction following, abstract concepts. So there's, we've got adjectives, we've got actions, we've got pronouns. Now, you're going to randomize them across these different response classes, and we want to measure the child's persistence and fluency at level 3. They're not going to remember that many different SDs without help. So whether you put each of those SDs on an index card and you have them shuffle up so that they are able to remember the different SDs that they deliver across those response classes, then as a practitioner, you have to have a way that you can recap what you actually learned in the continuing ed by having a book and the book isn't intended for you to open it up, read it, and then memorize everything, because that's never going to happen. None of us can do that. And I'm going to use this term because I think it's appropriate. It's like the Bible for generalization. It is meant to be used and carried with you from case to case, because not all the kids that you program ABA treatment for are having difficulties in the same areas of generalization. Kids, the levels of generalization, again, were intended to be taught across the levels, not one level at a time. And we tend to get into that process of linear thinking, oftentimes because it's easier. So the book is meant to say, okay, you know what, I really am having problems in training for generalization into the natural environment and in the verbal community. What did she say about that? What did the course actually do to break that down? And then you would actually take that portion of the book and use it for the children that you are having difficulty programming that for. So it's meant to be used as a resource that you carry with you and be able to pull out and use accordingly.
Another question from a student was that you mentioned that a lot of practitioners think they understand generalization conceptually, but they often have more to learn, or they don't know what they don't know. Can you expand on what you mean by this?
Yes, I would really like Lottie's input on this as well, since she was a receiver of my training on the R.E.A.L model. And part of what we oftentimes feedback that we get from people that we're training, and especially parents and other types of professionals, is that we speak the behavioral jargon too readily. Like, can you speak to our level? And I began to really think about that. And if you're going to be the true behavioral artist, you really need to know who your audience is, and you need to adjust accordingly. And so when we looked at generalization, as I said before, conceptually, if you took a test on generalization, you could probably pass it. But what I believe that practitioners don't know, what they don't know, is what does generalization actually look like when I go to program for it, without getting caught into, oh, he's not generalizing, he failed to generalize. Okay, why is that? I mean, I used to think, well, some kids with autism are just not going to generalize, and other kids are going to, and it really has to do with their skill level. None of us are perfect at generalization, and we're all doing it differently at different times. But it's something that requires you to rethink about how you were trained on the concepts of generalization and what that actually looks like when it comes to programming for generalization. So when the R.E.A.L model was introduced to many of the practitioners I trained, they said, I didn't even know that this existed. Well, no one ever taught this to me. So I'm going to have Madi elaborate on that for her, because I do believe that you'd get a lot out of what her feedback is.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in. I remember starting, at ABC 16 years ago, and Brenda started training me on the R.E.A.L model. And I had just recently got out of grad school. I had had a caseload. I had worked with several kids, and I did not know there was a systematic way to plan for generalization. And then I asked Brenda, well, where's this coming from? And she said, well, I created it. And I said, well, how come other people don't know about this? And she said, well, if you come to ABC, you learn about this. And it was literally a 15-year me pushing her to get this book written, the course done, because I really do feel the value in this process and just giving. I mean, we have probably a team of, I don't know, 100 RBTs that work at our company, and they all know how to implement utilizing the R.E.A.L model. So it's not like this crazy, you must have your PhD, in behavior analysis to understand conceptually how to do this. It's really a very, can be a very simple, easy way of planning for generalization that brand new technicians could pick up. Brenda touched on it a little bit in terms of just being able to incorporate the R.E.A.L model into any existing program. And I think that's really critical. We're not trying to give you any curriculum. We're not trying to say, this is what you need to do. We're saying plan for generalization, and here's how you do it. And when people say, oh, I do that already, I challenge that, because I challenge, whether or not these kids truly are generalizing the skills they're taught in an ABA program outside. I challenge that they do the same behavior with the BCBA that they do with the parent. I challenge that they do it in the community setting with all the environmental distractors. I challenge that they go to school and they're in a 1 to 20 setting, and they actually are able to show the classroom or the teacher what they know. I mean, and if you answer, no, my kid doesn't do that, then this course is for you, this book is for you, this process is for you. Because I thought I did generalization. I absolutely did. I could tell Brenda the definitions, I could tell her what I did, and I didn't do it. And I'm so incredibly grateful for the opportunity to have worked within a system of the R.E.A.L model and worked within a company that stands behind the R.E.A.L model, so that I could say, yes, I do plan for generalization, and this is how.
Thank you for sharing that, Madi. And good job on pushing Brenda to publish the book.
Oh.
Congratulations again, Brenda. I know you said
Thank
it was a huge project. So thank you for sharing it with all of us. Okay, and another student asked, what are some of the most common mistakes you see when it comes to planning for generalization?
One of the best takeaways that I got from an implicit technology of generalization from Stokes and Bearers is that one of the mistakes we make is not looking at generalization as an active process of learning, but rather we look at it more passively. I trained all this, and now the child's supposed to generalize without these training variables. And it isn't like that you have all these training conditions present to get a response to occur, or the child is able to respond to those specific SD or stimuli, and then all of a sudden you just take away everything. We have to look at how each of the stimulus conditions impact the child with respect to the responses that we're teaching. And when you look at let's just take imitation in general, and that it's a huge repertoire, and you can break that down into gross motor imitation, or with just motor imitation, play imitation. You can look at the way that kids imitate each other during play, but it's something that we have to program for in an active way. In other words, each step of the way, each new environment, each new setting that the child is participating in, we look at the active process of generalization. And so if we're able to do that, then we can treat generalization as an operant itself that is subject to the same reinforcement contingencies as behaviors that we teach that make up a child's ABA program. The second mistake that is oftentimes made in generalization is confusing the generality of behaviors with the generality of training procedures. The focus is on generalized behavior change with the child, but what are the expected generalized behaviors? It's not just about stimulus generalization. It's not just about response generalization. What is expected of the child in general when it comes to those types of generalization, and the generality process with respect to us going about training practitioners. Remember what Marty said, the effectiveness in our field is our ability to replicate and produce valid results. So we have to treat those two repertoires differently when it comes to programming for ABA treatment for children with autism. Third, again, and I had said this earlier, persistence. It's the measure of behavior of what we want the child to do, and maintenance changes in the environmental condition that are occurring at the same time. So confusing those two or not programming for that oftentimes is taken for granted, and you really learn that when you bring the child into the natural environment. We didn't teach the persistence enough for the child to be able to handle all the competing stimuli that occur in natural settings. And understanding that the different types of generalization, yes, they're delineated in textbooks, but you have to be mindful and actually purposely choose what it is that is expected with respect to the type of generalized behavior you want for the child within that context. And then last but not least, which is, and there's many, but these are the top 5, we don't get enough parent input and participation to be able to program for generalization within the family unit out there in the community. And one of the things that the generalization that the R.E.A.L model provides is an opportunity to involve parents from the very, very, very beginning, because it is absolutely crucial that they are part of the child's program when it comes to training for generalization in level 5, which is generalization into this verbal community.
Thank you, Brenda. So our final one is, you mentioned you wrote a poem recently, and we'd love to hear it. Would you be willing to share this with us?
Yes.
So I do have slides. And go ahead. Oh.
Okay, you can, however you want to do it.
Okay.
Let me see, I'll see how big it is. And
how does it look for you? Is it okay? Or do you want to?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
So I sat down one day and I thought, well, how can I really provide a way with respect to the R.E.A.L model as a gift to behavior analysts? It's really something I have a lot of passion for, and I really want as many practitioners to benefit from the R.E.A.L model. So I decided to write a poem, and it's just something I got inspired to do one evening. So I would like to read this to you. It really encapsulates what we talked about, and maybe not the entire essence of what the actual R.E.A.L model offers you, but it does give you a good idea about what you can take away from it. I am a behavior analyst, so it's the real gift for behavior analysts. I am a behavior analyst practitioner working with children on the autism spectrum, living in a world of chaos and distractions. I greet them each day to work and play, saying goodbye when I end my day. I could teach children the alphabet, how to count, identify colors, shapes, and even imitate. I was told by parents he didn't understand when everyone went home. He felt lost and confused, wanting to be left alone. No conversation and not wanting more. They found themselves saying, what was this all for? I asked myself, do I continue to do what I know? Surely there has to be more. The children I work with are not generalizing. Am I doing something that is compromising? Where do I look? Who do I know? I want to increase the world the child with autism knows. What is it that I'm looking for? I cannot afford not to grow. Then I learned about the R.E.A.L model, recreate environments to accelerate learning. a behavioral framework to teach for generalization, comprehensive, systematic, and works within any ABA program based on a strong behavior analytic foundation. I start with training stimulus control, moving toward making the program whole. I concurrently teach other life skills, communication, play, and seeing the child's life unfold. I introduce environmental distractions when the child is near. Programming now becomes crystal clear. I know I must be informed by the behavior principles I hold so dear as I move intervention to what naturally appears in everyday life from month to year. I use the real individual child matrix as a map to integrate the child into day-to-day life. Then I bridge concepts and skills and build repertoires where the child will begin to be a self-starter, asking, giving, initiating, and conversing, not seen prior to intervention days since. Moving from teaching for generalization in the natural environment, I'm mindful of my judgment with societal norms and careful not to scorn. The child now needs to learn to adapt from the consequences of life's mishaps. New contingencies, new environments bring opportunities of growth and learning. Now I see what ABA programming offers. It was never about me. The child with autism benefits from the world, but not of the world. Teaching for generalization from beginning to end is what we can all agree.
Thank you, Brenda. And you said this will be, I think we're publishing it in a blog through ABA Tech, right, Lisa? And it might be on your website too eventually?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you. So that was actually all we had. There were 2 questions earlier. I kind of jumped over because I think you had covered them in earlier questions. We have met the requirements for CEUs, although we still have the webinar open for another 10 minutes. If you want, Brenda and Mari, we could see if there's anything you want to answer live, or if there's anything maybe, I didn't ask you that you wanted to share or expand on.
There was, there was a few questions that we answered in the Q&A while we were going through the webinar. This is a webinar that's offered if you are a CEU course, or if you're also enrolled in the CEU course. So this is not part 1 of the CEU course. This is a separate webinar, and hopefully people can have interest and then register for the webinar. In the chat, the CEU webinar registration link is there. And like Allison said earlier, if you register for the course, there's a discount for the book, or you can also, there's links to purchase the book separately from the course if you would like. And then there was a few questions about if the parents can learn the R.E.A.L model, and absolutely yes. In the R.E.A.L model book, there are specific parents integrated chapters. In every chapter, there is a section for parent involvement, how to plan for generalization for parents specifically. That is a huge component of the R.E.A.L model. And then there was a question about the clinic that Brenda and I work with, and that's ABC Applied Behavior Consultants located in California. So those were just some of the questions. And then I wasn't sure, Allison, was there 3 codes or just 2?
There was not, there was only 2.
Okay, only 2 codes.
Yep.
So that is answered the last few questions that we got.
And then one of the things I wanted to elaborate on is part 1 of the course versus part 2 and 3. So given all behavior analysts, practitioners' backgrounds can vary with respect to experience, not necessarily so much in the academic coursework, although during the time that I was getting my master's degree, we read a lot of books written by B.F. Skinner, The Behavior of Organisms, The Science and Human Behavior. And at least with some of the people that we've interviewed, or in terms of the behavior consultant position, I had one full training class with my staff, and not one person in that book had read a book from B.F. Skinner. So I found that pretty surprising. So I'm not sure what's really changed over time. I'm not saying that you're less effective because you didn't read a book by B.F. Skinner, but clearly all of what has been written or trained to you with respect to behavior analysis was based off Skinner's work. So course 1 really spends a lot of time on the necessity of learning about the symptomology of autism and other types of behavioral disorders that are comorbidities of autism, especially with ADHD, ADD, or anxiety disorder. And so I spend some time in part 1 talking about how those various disorders may interact and how it may affect the way that you go about assessing. I also spend a great deal of time of talking about the must-dos for any ABA treatment to be effective, and that I took for granted a while ago that, or even when I first started training, that people came from the same backgrounds. So even though you might have similar academic training, it doesn't mean that everyone's operating off the same terminology, off the same different ways that we go about actually starting ABA services. So I spend some time on, well, what makes you effective based off the science of behavior analysis with respect to ABA intervention? What does that entail? I also provide you in part 1 a summary of the actual levels of generalization with videotape coverage to be able to show you what you're going to get as a whole, and as an introduction and as a whole when I go to break down those levels of generalization in part 2 and 3. So it's a really good review of typical development, the actual diagnosis itself, and how it affects your ability to really begin the assessment process and know where to start intervention with that child. So I would highly recommend it. But if you're a well-trained, seasoned behavior analyst, you may not need to do part 1, but it will give you a very good background in terms of where the R.E.A.L model really came from in regards to that information I just covered with you.
Thank you for sharing that, Brenda. I'm sorry, that was one I skipped over.
Oh, no problem.
And just on that note too, a reminder, we do have 2 more webinars coming up, and the way we design these is this first one we figured would be more about, we assumed we'd be getting questions more about the content in part 1 because it's a large course, there's a lot of good stuff in it, and we figured the folks that are already in the course probably would have progressed through part 1 when we prompted them to submit questions. So for the second webinar, which will happen in February, and we'll post more information about it soon on the website, we'll probably be expecting some questions from students about the content in part 2. And then the last webinar we have planned right now in May, we're expecting to be getting some questions from students about content in part 3. So there should be more information to come. Let's see. Is there anything else, Brenda or Madi, that we didn't ask that you want to cover in the last 4 or 5 minutes? Did we do good today?
I think we covered it.
Yeah, I think everything is covered, but feel free to reach out to ABA Technologies or the team, or go to our website, therealmodel.com. There's email addresses in there. If you have questions later, if you get the book and you have questions, or if you take the course and you have questions, feel free to reach out. We're happy to answer any questions. We're happy to offer any support.